Broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and the 2 p.m. hour, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk, weeknights at 8 p.m. Welcome to the Gaily Show. There's a lot of news happening today, obviously, and you can catch up with some of the great shows from earlier today, Stephanie Miller and Tom Hartman, and on Choose Views. Of course, there was Joan Esposito and Patty Vasquez. And coming up next, there will be more news that you can catch up on with the Matt McNeil Show. However, for us today, it's our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the majority of the episode to help us think more clearly and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. After that, I'll continue my Queer and the Cosmos essay series. Today's guest is Dr. Gwen Bass. Dr. Bass is the author of Immaculate Misconception, a story of biology and belonging. It is the story of how in the early 1980s, 95% of all artificial inseminations were performed for married heterosexual couples. Among the other 5% were people like Gwen's parents, lesbians navigating a homophobic medical system ready to deny them children. Immaculate Misconception isn't just a window into a sliver of queer history. It raises questions that we all grapple with: who we are and the forces that influence us. It's a reflection on nature, nurture, identity, and belonging. Dr. Bass is an administrator in higher education and has developed graduate programs for teachers. She also provides professional development and mentoring for clinicians and educators in schools, government agencies, and nonprofits. Dr. Bass, welcome to the Gaily Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so I gave the briefest of brief descriptions of your book. Maybe we should start with how you thought about your family when you were growing up, before you maybe discovered everything that sort of happened to create that family.
Yeah. So, I mean, we all kind of grow up into a situation and we feel like it's normal because it's just our family and we're egocentric little people. What was different for me kind of growing up in that dynamic was that I would look around and be like, so nobody else's family looks like my family. And a lot of the language that I was given as a kid to use to describe my family, I had a mom, biological mom, and I had that as language. And then I also was living with her, was raised by her partner at the time, who, because my parents had to stay closeted, we referred to as my other parent. So it's not like the two mom model that you see now. It's very, very different in that sense. So I would kind of just walk around with like, yeah, well, my mom and my other parent, and people would be like, well, is your other parent a dad? Like, who's this guy? Like, who are you talking about? And then I was also, raised in a family with her son. So my other parent had a son from her previous marriage to a man, and I referred to him as my brother. And so for a lot of my sort of young existence, there were many things for me that felt like super validating and normal. Like my family had really strong connections to the queer community. Lots of people in that community sort of had family structures similar to my parents, often not having kids yet because we were some of the first, but, like women who looked sort of, queer, for lack of a better word, were definitely a part of my community growing up. It was very like normal for two women to be in love with each other. And that was definitely modeled for me. But when I would go to preschool, I had lots of experiences of kind of looking around and being like, and I referred to my other parent as Juju because her name was Judith. And when I was little, I couldn't say Judith. So I would say like, well, like I went with my mom and Juju, and people were like, what's a Juju? Like, what are you even talking about? So, it was an interest. So, I mean, to answer your question, I feel like for me, growing up, it was both totally normal. And I knew, but mostly from the narratives that I was given as a kid, that what we were doing was okay, like from my family and sort of like core sense. And also there was a very clear sense from the community I was raised in at large and society at large and what life was like in the 80s, that like, this was not like the world wasn't totally ready for us in a very particular way. And nothing about me was really reflected outside of that community, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I want to fast forward here to 36 years old, and you do a DNA test and you learn some things.
I do. So I had been very clear, I by the time I was 36, I had adopted 3 kids. I was like, I was married to a woman. I had kind of just been like, listen, I'm doing life differently. I was raised on this belief that family, is who you choose to be in family with, and biology doesn't even really matter. And then one of my parents, my other parent, Juju, actually reached out and was like, hey, listen, some of the other women who inseminated using the same doctor that we did, like, it turns out some of those kids are related. And like, let me just show you a few photographs. And so she sent me some pictures and I was like, this is kind of creepy. You know, like, I've never seen anyone who looks like me because I don't have other biological siblings that I grew up knowing.
Yeah.
So I was kind of like, all right, you know, maybe. She was like, take a DNA test and see. And I kind of, even at the time, was like, well, what's the point? Because I already know who I am. Family doesn't matter in terms of biology. It's just who you choose to be in community with and close with. So eventually I did the test and you know, matched with several other sisters and eventually a brother. And now I think there's about 12 of us. And through that process, you know, started talking to these sisters of mine. And something so unexpected was really reflected back to me about like, oh wait, there is something about being in community and sharing a biological connection to people. And I hadn't really thought about like my lineage on my dad's side, or just, you know, I do a lot of work in the field of sort of like trauma and understanding inherited trauma or intergenerational components. And I carry with me like this whole piece of DNA that I hadn't even really kind of been willing to shed light on or really thought was important. And so for me, connecting with those siblings and finding that community in that way was almost like the reverse experience that I think a lot of people who are queer have, which is to grow up in a family that like doesn't quite fit them. You know, biologically they're related, but from a sense of belonging, maybe they feel like parts of them don't belong. My experience was kind of the opposite in an interesting way.
Yeah. You write then, to follow up on that, you write in the book's description that in 1982, your birth was an inherent challenge to society's definition of family. And you describe the misconception as a scientific experiment. Share more about that then.
Sure. So, I mean, I had this language, and I mean, I don't know if I was precocious or if I was just given this language, but I'm, you know, like there's a vignette I write about in the book where I'm a 4-year-old sitting on the carpet at preschool. And I very vividly remember these experiences where, you know, it's like go around and we're all going to say something about who's in our family, knowing that like in this progressive community I was raised in, I was the diversity that was coming to that conversation to like help everybody feel more inclusive. Um, and so in that conversation, really having like this whole like, so I have a sperm donor and people are like, what's sperm? Like, we don't even know what that is, you know? And I was like, what do you mean you don't know what that is? Well, I have a donor. And people are like, what's a donor? So there were these ways that not only was I sort of on the very sort of like front lines, almost trying to kind of push the envelope in terms of what people understood could make a family. And the fact that I didn't know my dad, right? Like we had divorce was kind of becoming more common in the 80s. There were people who were single moms, but there weren't families that really looked like mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember that. I remember sitting at my neighbor's house. I was really good friends with my best friend was my neighbor, and I was over there and her grandparents were visiting from down south. I grew up in the Northeast, and they were like, what do you mean you don't know your dad? And I was like, well, I mean, you know, and I'm like, you know, 8, 9, 10, just kind of giving this explanation of how this technology is possible. And they're like, really? You know, like it's something they hadn't heard of. And so, you know, it was both, and it's been an interesting process to be raised by parents who made that choice, right? So there's like, I think now as a queer person, I certainly look back on their choices and go, that was really powerful and so important for our community, for people to start really figuring out how to build families. And also being at the front lines of that was really complicated as a kid, just trying to explain, you know, and it's my mom passed several years ago, actually right before I wrote the book, which I think probably in some ways made it possible for me to write the book. But she passed and I was looking through some of her old things, and she was just like a person who saved everything. And she had these articles that were written at the time of my conception. And there was a real debate in the medical community about whether or not the technology, as the obstetrician who ultimately inseminated my mom used to call it, he would say the technology is available and it's not for me to decide how to use it. And in these articles was all of this sort of pushback and question of, we don't even know what happens for kids who grow up with this situation. Like this could be a wild success or an absolute disaster. You know, and I'd like to think that it's more on the side of success than disaster, but it definitely was new.
We're talking with Dr. Gwen Bass, author of Immaculate Misconception, a story of biology and belonging. So I guess there are some listeners who may be asking then, and may I ask, was there then a shared donor that allowed for 12 siblings?
So basically, it was almost impossible for my parents to find a doctor who was willing to inseminate. And for a variety of reasons, including that to protect our family, they needed to stay closeted, because if my non-biological mom came out at work, she could have lost her job, and that would have been really difficult for our family. And there were lots of other reasons why it was important. So, in the broader scheme, but particularly as it related to the medical piece. So they found a doctor who was willing to do the insemination, but completely under the table. Most other places that were doing clinics that were doing the inseminations for what were single women, not lesbians, single women. So my mom went in as a single woman with her friend. And most of those clinics were requiring psychological evals for anyone who wanted to inseminate. We didn't have, like, in the 1980s, weren't very favorable in terms of single motherhood. And so the idea was like, why would you ever want to choose this and stay single? You should be finding a man, you should be having a baby the natural way, right? So she found this doctor who basically completely under the table was like, listen, I know a guy. I have, I can hook you up, but I'm not going to document this as an insemination in your record. This is just like low key, you and me, hand me the cash, I'll take care of it. As far as anyone needs to know, this was a routine medical exam. And so once, my parents had a successful conception, conceived successfully, and they were sort of far enough along that, like, no one could take it back. They started to tell their friends, like, hey, we found this guy. And so the lesbian community within Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where I was born, really started to be like, okay, let's go see, Dr. Taylor. He'll help us out here if we want to conceive. And so all of the women who conceived received a different story about the donor. So my mom was Jewish, and she really wanted a Jewish donor. So she said, hey, can I have a Jewish donor? Also, I'm short, can we have somebody tall? Like, she had this whole list of things she wanted. The doctor said, absolutely, you got it. I had another sibling I've recently discovered.
You hold that thought real quick.
Yeah.
I've got to fit in a very quick break. More with Dr. Gwen Bass when we come back. Connect with more progressive news and radio at am950radio.com and heartlandsignal.com. You're listening to The Gaily Show. Welcome back to The Gaily Show. I am your host, John Parker. It is 21 minutes past the hour. Today is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode. My guest is Dr. Gwen Bass. With decades of experience in K-12 teaching, school counseling, teacher training, and direct service, Dr. Bass helps schools create identity-affirming environments and design accessible learning opportunities. I'm going to have questions about that coming up. She is the author of Immaculate Misconception, a story of biology and belonging, the story of her lesbian parents conceiving through artificial insemination in the 1980s. Gwen, before the break, you were talking about how lesbian parents would go to this doctor and say they were like asking for very particulars of like who they wanted their donor to be. Can we pick up the story there?
Sure. So in the same way as, like, we would go through a registry now, they didn't have that available to them. So they would put in these subtle requests. One of them was told that the donor was like a tall blonde guy. Someone else was told he was Egyptian. There were all kinds of different sort of things that our parents were looking for. And everyone heard the same, yep, you got it, no problem. It turns out he was none of the things that, he's like, which is fine. I think we're all at peace with who we are. It's okay. But he was a Hispanic guy who worked for, a local in the trades locally, and he was inseminating to put his wife through nursing school, which we've come to find out. So very long story short, and I write some about this in the book, but my siblings and I kind of worked together, and with some help from other folks, pieced enough of the few pieces of information we had together to discover who he was. And so we did find him. He had passed by the time we found him. He passed several years prior, which in some ways just felt like okay, like totally reasonable poetic justice to all of us. We were like, you know what, we never knew you. We've seen the picture of you, so we can kind of, see ourselves in him, and we all really resemble him quite closely. And we read his obituary, and we know lots of different things about him. And I think many of those things that we heard really resonated with us about who we are and the things we noticed that we had in common once we started communicating. And so for me, that piece around biology and connection really, I've only found later, and I can say, like, some of my siblings I talk to almost every day now. I didn't know them for 36 years. And we talk almost all the time, and it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, like it's almost like if you wrote into your journal and it wrote back to you. Like, it's like a very familiar sort of close connection that I have with many of them.
So talk me through the idea then of biology as belonging, because I think in the queer community, as you were, saying earlier, it's about chosen family, the families that we choose, the families that we bond with, that we have those connections with. Talk us through biology as belonging.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was shocked that biology mattered, or that I felt any connection in that way. I can certainly say that I think biology as belonging, and as I think about it within the queer community, is often really, about, like, I think I immediately go to gender affirmation and people who
Mhm.
pursue different kinds of gender affirming surgeries or different kinds of care to ensure that they biologically match who they feel like, right? I think, for me, that, like I said, that just really happened in reverse. And I think people make a lot of assumptions about who we are based on what we look like or how we present in the world. And sometimes that really, like, I when I walked through the world as a kid, people didn't know that my family was different. And so there was something very special for me about finding people who'd had that same experience, and not just tangentially within the queer community, but people who shared my biology and had that experience. And again, like I said, I think, as I've done more work around intergenerational trauma and understanding how that plays out for folks, I certainly feel more, I don't know if it's like honor or connection or awareness of my own biological connections. And that those have been really profound for me. And it's affected the way that I think about, like, I adopted 3 kids. And I think prior, not to say that, I think it's shifted the way that I think about their connections with their biology and the ways that I want to affirm those connections.
Absolutely. For folks who are not quite sure what intergenerational trauma is, can you kind of unpack that for us?
Sure. So, intergenerational trauma is basically the idea that over the course of generations, subsequent generations are impacted by the experiences that their ancestors had. So, a very simple example, I'm Jewish. I come from folks who were historically, like, if you just think specifically one generation back about Holocaust survivors, there are things that were encoded into the DNA of Holocaust survivors that affect subsequent generations of folks. So, like, for example, you see higher levels of anxiety in, like, I don't want to speak too generally for folks who aren't super familiar, but one example is that you can see higher levels of anxiety among folks from communities who've experienced persecution, or if you come from a lineage of people who were displaced over time, that can affect the ways it affects parenting, right? And then it affects the impact that it has on kids. And so often we think about, like, oh, I had a parent who was really abusive, right? So of course that's going to affect you from an intergenerational lens. The more we're starting to understand about intergenerational trauma, the more we're seeing that lineages of people who've had certain kinds of experiences, literally the DNA is changed in subsequent generations. And so we see trauma ostensibly be really, like, biologically being inherited. So there's the things that we know about on the surface and the things that actually are affected in our gene expression.
We are talking with Dr. Gwen Bass, author of Immaculate Misconception, A Story of Biology and Belonging. I want to be mindful, this is a study of mice, but there was a study looking at intergenerational transmission of trauma. And the one study that most stuck out to me was, and again, I want to be mindful, we're talking about mice, not humans, but there was the first generation where they exposed them to the smell of strawberries. Have you heard of this study where they exposed them to the smell of strawberries, and then there was a negative, like, shock or something bad happened to them, and they closely correlated, Pavlovian response, they closely correlated those two things together: strawberry smell, shock. It was like multiple generations of mice who would, when they put in the smell of strawberry, they would have the symptoms of, oh my gosh, I'm going to be shocked, or there's something bad's about to happen. And I think that to me was a really great example of how all of these, these things can be passed down. When I started learning about that, I'm, Armenian American. And so like my family survived, my great grandparents and grandparents survived the Armenian genocide. And just when I learned about that, I'm like, oh, and when my therapist, I was like starting to talk, I'm like, okay, this might have some explanatory power.
Yeah.
What you may be going through and how you're like how I'm responding to things and why things are sort of like hypervigilant or, anxiety or, all sorts of stuff like that. And I'm sorry, I'm sort of making this about me right now, but we're going to have to fit in another break here. When we come back, though, I kind of want to begin to tie this to the work that you do as an educator, right? About creating, sense of belonging, creative, inclusive spaces, particularly because we're going through this absolutely horrifying political moment currently. So I would love to hear your thoughts as someone who deals with this on a daily basis of what we should be doing and how we can be proactive. So we are going to take that break. None of this would be possible, folks, without our sponsors and our advertisers who help us create progressive news and radio and queer news and radio. So shop with them, do business with them, tell them that you heard about them on The Gaily Show or on AM 950 radio or on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. More after this break. You are listening to The Gaily Show. Coming to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and the 2 p.m. hour, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk, weeknights at 8 p.m. Welcome back to The Gaily Show. I'm your host, John Parker. It is 33 minutes past the hour. Hello to those also streaming us on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@thegailyshow. It is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. With me today is Dr. Gwen Bass. Dr. Bass is the author of Immaculate Misconception, a story of biology and belonging. And it's also was an administrator in higher education, has developed graduate programs for teachers, also provides professional development and mentoring for clinicians and educators in schools, government agencies, and nonprofits. Dr. Bass, as an educator, I would be remiss not to ask you how you're processing and responding to this moment that we're living through, particularly as you advise and train educators on how to address trauma in the classroom and creating inclusive environments and universal design. Those are a lot of big things. The floor is yours.
It's a big question. But the first thing that came to mind as I was kind of hearing what you're saying is, and it kind of connects to what you're talking about, intergenerational trauma, and the idea that the example you gave was having a really hypervigilant nervous system, right? So I notice everything, I'm constantly distracted. And I think a lot of us are medicating around with technology, for example, as you know, we certainly see that in kids. And so I guess I'll say a few things. One is similar to how I feel like we can often make assumptions about kids and their identities and sort of based on what they look like. I feel like it's really important to approach and this is like so silly and simple, but just to approach people with curiosity. And I think that there's less of that now than we've seen historically in a kind of a unique way, right? Because there's simultaneously this major focus on kind of weeding out people who don't look like the norm, is, you know, like ostensibly on a broad scale. Mm-hmm. But what I find in my work with kids and in supporting teachers and clinicians around their work with kids is that the more curious and straightforward we can be with kids about asking them questions about who they are, about like not assuming, about just building connections around their interests and being incredibly straightforward. It's like a shockingly simple antidote to what's happening on a broader scale right now, which is to say, you belong in this box and therefore we're going to treat you like this. And I think it's incredibly validating for people to have that experience. Mm-hmm. I also feel like there's kind of this interesting piece that I'm noticing in a lot of the spaces that I orbit where we aren't great about having honest conversations with kids about what's actually happening. And
Mm-mm.
so in the same way that we carry generational trauma in our DNA, kids are breathing the air of what's happening politically, whether their parents are having conversations on either side or in any way about what's going on, right? Like that toxicity is really in the air right now. And unless we help kids put words to it, they are little egocentric beings who feel like the world revolves around them, and they should, because they're dependent and they need it to feel that way. But simultaneously, they interpret anything that feels toxic or unloving as their fault. And so the more that we can do to kind of reify this message that there's a lot going on, you're really important, right? Like, let's be honest with you about what you're experiencing. What do you notice? How do you feel, right? Those are things that we're not doing broad scale a great job of engaging with kids around. And the less we talk about that big stuff that they're feeling and not having language to kind of put words to, the more we send them the message, like, you're not worth talking about. Like, what you feel isn't real. What's happening isn't something you're worthy of hearing about or talking about, and your experiences aren't valid. And so when I think about my own experience as a kid growing up in this funky family that didn't look anything like what I was seeing around me, one of the most valuable gifts my parents gave me was like, they weren't afraid to have conversations with me. They gave me words to put to my experience. My mom was like an incredibly staunch advocate, sometimes, more so or like in louder ways than I would have liked. But ultimately her goal was to just say, listen, you are like, what we're doing is really different. And I want you to be raised in communities and spaces where people are validating. And if they're not, I'm going to talk to them about it. And we don't have to stay here. Like, right. We can put you in a different after school program, or we can make different choices about what's going to happen for you on this sports team, because I feel like there's some homophobia happening. Are you feeling that too? And there were things that I probably wouldn't have interpreted as homophobic or sort of bigoted that really were. And, like subtle things, like as a kid, I remember hearing certain slurs from teachers, even, at school, and then coming home and making sort of like being like, Mom, so-and-so said this thing. Isn't that kind of funny? Because everyone was laughing at school. My mom was like, that's not funny at all. Like, there's nothing funny about that. And it's so inappropriate that even came up, and then she would go talk to the teacher. Right. And so that's just one example. But when I think about systems supporting kids, I feel like the best we can do is to be really honest with our kids in sort of developmentally and culturally appropriate ways to say, here's what's happening. And tell me about what you're experiencing, and let's talk about it, and give you words to be able to advocate for yourself and also make sense of what's going on for you.
In case you're just joining us, we're talking with Dr. Gwen Bass, the author of Immaculate Misconception, a story of biology and belonging, who is also an educator working to provide professional development and mentoring for clinicians and educators in schools, government agencies, and nonprofits. Dr. Bass, there is a case in front of the Supreme Court right now to provide religious exemptions for parents to pull their students out of classrooms that are reading an LGBTQ picture book. That's, a children's picture book that's dealing with one thing, but it's got a picture on one page of a pride parade, or it's got a picture of two, same gender couple who are getting married. How should teachers, the problem, and the Supreme Court is most likely going to side with them, which would then mean that parents can pull their kids, which means teachers would have to create separate lessons plans, put them in different classrooms. I mean, it's just going to create chaos for these classrooms. And the fear is that teachers will then go, it's not worth it. We'll just not do any, LGBTQ content in preschool through 12th grade, because we just, why would I go through this when I already have 17,000 other things to be dealing with as an educator, because we underfund our schools, and that's a different show topic. How then would you advise? I mean, how are you either thinking through curriculum or ways, if this passes, of how teachers can still be inclusive of their LGBTQ students?
So, I mean, and maybe this is a little bit unpopular, but I'm going to say it anyway.
So I work
in a school. I work in a school right now. I felt like I'd been working with adults for so long that I needed to go back to kids to just get a little street cred. So a couple days a week, I work in a school because I feel like I need to know what I'm doing. Needed some new material, but these kids. So one of the things that the school has is a curriculum around self-advocacy and sexual health. And that's not something everybody wants their second grader being a part of a conversation about. So they have an opt-out policy similar to the one that is before the Supreme Court right now, where parents can say, I don't want my kid to participate in that lesson. What I think, and I will say that at the school that I work out, a very small handful of families opt their kids out for whatever reason. Those kids have something they go do, but they are the outliers. And I think my unpopular plug would be to say, I don't like condone or think we're headed in the right track by trying to allow folks to opt out of expanding our definition of what is normal and what is okay by sharing picture books with, you know, diverse families, or kind of creating different kind of options for people to see what's possible, right? That whole idea of I have to see me to be me, I think is so important for little kids. And I think part of the question that the Supreme Court is sort of grappling with is simply introducing those kinds of topics, like, you know, coercing kids into becoming more gender expansive or something, right? I think it's just important for kids to have lots of visual representations of lots of things, right? So I'm definitely on board for that. And I will say, and maybe this is me being incredibly progressive, I walk by those kids who are sitting outside of the lessons while their class is having an awesome time, having a really cool discussion and reading a book, and think, it sucks that you're missing out on that. And I want that to feel uncool to you. Like I want you to feel like, and not in a shaming way, but in a like, I want you to know that there's something you're missing out on, and that I want you to want to buy into that, right? And I think, so when I in an ideal world, if this were to pass, I would want the kids who are being opted out to feel like, hey, I want some agency here. I want to be a part of what my class is getting to do. Like, that's really cool. That's where the cool stuff is happening. So I think for educators, I would encourage you to just think about it from the perspective of like, you get to do this stuff. You should keep doing it. And let's make that the cool thing that people want to be a part of, not something that people are more and more people are kind of opting out of.
My unpopular opinion is that if this passes, then all the students who are exempt should have to go to the library and write an essay on separation of church and state and the Constitution.
Totally fair. Totally fair.
I don't know if this would be an obvious and unpopular opinion, but for me, and it's scary, but I'm like, the overall majority of perpetration of sexual abuse is by straight cis men, and our kids are being exposed to that. And if you don't give them any agency on how to report that, you may not like that it's happening, but it's happening. And, you know, that for me is, you know, another thing of why we need to have that education in elementary schools. But, you know, I'm not going to get in that fight with them right now. I am curious, though, since you're doing that and you're being in the classrooms, building your street cred, how do you see, there's this idea that always the next generation is going to be more inclusive and more progressive when it comes to LGBTQ, you know, people and identities, you know, and et cetera. And then the last election sort of began to challenge that with how Gen Z, the 18 to 24-year-olds were voting. And so I'm curious, as you're working with students right now, do you still see that trend happening? I mean, is that just something that we like to tell ourselves as the Zennials and the, you know, Xers and what?
I feel so optimistic, and it could be because I live in a relatively progressive community, right? So like, I know that I hold one small slice of reality. And it's a relatively chosen slice. So I miss out on a lot of the negative rhetoric, but I also know that this is happening on a broader scale. So I have 4 kids. They range in age from 11 to 16. So a lot is coming out in the process of their adolescence. One of my kids is, you know, non-binary. There are other kids who are sort of gender expansive in different ways. And with the kids I work with too, I just feel like I have so much hope about how willing kids are right now to let people be who they are. And I'm the hill I will die on as a parent has to do with technology and technology use and abuse. So I'm not like huge into technology, and what you're going to hear is very contradictory to like my normal feeling, but there is so much on the internet right now. I feel like when I think about how I took in news, we were talking to somebody the other day about baby Jessica, which was like a really big deal in the 80s. And they were like, how did you even know she was down the well? And I was like, no, it was like every day you'd come home and you'd be like, did she get out yet? You know?
Yeah.
But like, there was this way we consume news that was so narrow and so specific. And now everything's stuff is hanging out all over the place. And if there's a silver lining to that in my mind, it's that kids see lots of different ways to be in the world. You know, and obviously there are algorithms and things that feed them different stuff, but my kids have all had like multiple friends who've, you know, different genders over time and different chosen names. And I like, they'll refer to someone and I'm like, who is that? And they're used to be, now is. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Like, got it. You know, but that sort of comfort with expansion and flexibility and being who you are actually does feel really possible, especially with younger kids right now. So I feel hopeful.
I am so glad to hear that. Also, be curious to see how Australia's new law banning social media for under 16-year-olds plays out, because that is something I could get on board with. But again, different show episode. We are including links in our show notes and on our website to buy Immaculate Misconception, A Story of Biology and Belonging. I've got less than a minute left, but Dr. Bass, how can folks connect with you either online or also to bring you to their school or do professional development with you?
Sure. The easiest way to reach me is probably on my website, which is Dr. Gwen, Gwen, last name Bass, Bass, so drgwenbass.com. You can also find me on social media at the same handle, Dr. Gwen Bass, on Instagram and things like that.
Perfect. And we also previously met doing an episode of 7 Minutes in Book Heaven. Folks can go to thisquarebook.com. It is the August 1st, 2023 episode. I can't believe it's been that long. So great to see you again, Dr. Bass.
So great to see you. Thank you so much for having me and for this amazing work you're doing in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you for the work you're doing in the world. Coming up, folks, next, I continue my Queer and the Cosmos essay series. One last break, but lots to get to on The Gaily Show. Welcome back to The Gaily Show. I'm your host, John Parker. It is 9 minutes before the top of the hour. Every Thursday, I close out our Thinking Queerly episodes with a weekly essay series I call Queer and the Cosmos, which is an opportunity to understand queer life through the exploration of the cosmos. Here is my latest essay, available only here on The Gaily Show. Light year number 10, Space Snow. It's the time of the year where I become slightly irrational. And by slightly, I mean full-on irrational. And by irrational, I mean prone to outbursts of anger and cursing. It's the time of the year when my patience is gone with winter. If my skin feels cold and raw, I spit. If I see gray clouds, I shout bleep. If someone tries to tell me the temperature will be just above freezing, I tell them to shove it. It's the time of the year when I feel genuinely claustrophobic in sweaters and I feel raving urges to punch meteorologists in the throat. Irrational. It's the time of the year that if you mention the word snow, I will uncork on you. And I actually quite like snow. Love it, actually, at Christmas time with the lights and the songs and the decorations and the wisps of frosty breath as you're standing outside admiring it all. There is no greater human invention than the snow day. It's a delightful thrill to cross-country ski down a hill. I revel in my collection of winter coats, with one for each occasion of snow. There's my classy snowfall coat, my gusty snowfall coat, my polar vortex snowfall coat. It's the time of year now, though, when even those coats exhaust me. If I have to put them on one more time, I swear to God I will burn this building to the ground just to feel warm again. True, I do have a biological need for starlight. I have osteoporosis. What that practically means is that starlight on my skin gives me the vitamin D to quite literally make my bones stronger and denser. I feel a visceral need for it, like a coyote for meat. And when I find it, I yip and howl for the other coyotes. It's here. The hot starlight is over here. It's the time of year where I don't howl for the moon, but the sun star. And true, I have a mental health need for it. Psychologically, my mood brightens. Again, literally, when I stand in that sultry starlight, it's that moment you experience when you transition from sleep to wakefulness. That is the sensation I feel when I just stand in the sun star, let alone bask in it. Keeping it from me is a surefire way to unleash a feral, response. So last week, when the godforsaken algorithms of the internet found an article I might like, I raged because the headline was Space Snow Visible in Bright Baby Solar System. The NASA article is from 2016. How? Why? What possessed the algorithms to pull that article from 9 years ago into my orbit? I fed it no search terms that would have resulted in Chrome suggesting it to me. But here we are, and now I'm sharing my burden with you. If I have to suffer through this, then so do you. Apparently, yes, it snows in space. Obviously, I'm not surprised it snows on planets. Everyone knows there are planets covered in ice. I was surprised in regard to Mars. I think of Mars as a perpetual desert, which in my mind translates to hot. But apparently the average temperature is minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Not only does that mean I will never, ever set foot on the red planet, but back in 2008, NASA's Phoenix lander observed water ice snow at the North Pole. Now, what I've learned is that to create our planetary home, you need space snow. After a star is born, there's large disks of gas and dust that rotate around it. These ultimately accumulate into clumps of gas and dust. These grow bigger, eventually to the size of planets. Obviously, the star is hot. And this means that any water within a certain geographical distance of it is gaseous. But if you fly out further away from the star, say about 280 miles, you'll find that the temperature cools. In that low pressure environment, the gassy water molecules transform and coat all the dust and particles with ice. This is called the water-snow line, space snow. Then in 2016, in Chile, the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array, ALMA, captured the first ever image of that water-snow line, but not in the way they intended. They weren't even looking for it. They were observing the star V883 Orionis. Suddenly, V883 Orionis flamed brighter, 400 times more luminous than our sun star. Large amounts of material from its surrounding disk of gas and dust started falling onto the surface of V883 Orionis, and like a campfire, this new fuel caused it to flare so bright, so hot that it pushed its water-snow line away from itself. How far? Well, it was already about 280 miles away. Now the water-snow line was 3.7 billion miles away. Why does it matter? The water-snow line may actually explain how water helps create planets. Inside the water-snow line, where it's hotter, the water vaporizes, allowing for dust to coagulate into rocks, right? The water is gaseous because it's too close to the star. Rocks then begin to accumulate into bigger rocks. They smash into each other, et cetera, until you have a planet-sized rock. Outside the water-snow line, where the temperature is colder, everything is covered in ice. And as it accumulates, you basically get a cosmic snowball. And as these snowballs get bigger and bigger, because of the ice and water, they grow into the colossal gas giants. Jupiter, for instance. In 2023, the James Webb Telescope began to observe other instances of this happening, providing more data that this water-snow line is a key stage in the development of the various types of planets in a solar system, the various types of planetary homes. But for right now, I appreciate the fact that it was the lack of snow and ice that led to my own home on this planet. We don't have an accretion disk anymore orbiting our sun. We are way too old for that. But it's nice to know that our original snow and ice was exactly where I wanted it, billions of miles away, creating other planets and leaving me alone. That is my essay for today. Coming up next is the Matt McNeil Show. Follow us on Blue Sky for more progressive news and analysis. We're at thegaileyshow.org. You can watch us anytime on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@thegaileyshow. And until tomorrow, keep it queer, America.